Planning and Development Act 2024 marks a major landmark for planning in Ireland. But what will implementation actually look like in practice?
It is heartening to see that government, the legislature and so on has further consolidated the importance of there being a planning system and are now finally starting to grapple with the issues around resourcing it, though there's still quite a bit of road to travel.
I'm Sean O'Leary and you're very welcome to the Planners Podcast. The new Planning Act is presented as one part of delivering housing, infrastructure and competitiveness, all while addressing the climate and biodiversity emergencies. And today we're unpacking what the Act means for the work of the Office of the Planning Regulator and its role in meeting these challenges, particularly in forward planning. We'll also discuss the broader work of the OPR, including in research, building public confidence and awareness, highlighting innovation, and looking to ensure the planning system is properly resourced into the future. Joining us to explore all of this is Niall Cussen, Chief Executive and Planning Regulator at the OPR, who brings more than 30 years of experience across the Irish planning system. Niall, you're very welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Sean. Delighted to be here.
So just to kick off, I thought it would be useful to just maybe hear about how you ended up where you are and maybe your career in planning so far.
Okay. I suppose just in terms of my own background, I have been working in planning for about 36 years, I think, at this stage, and over a variety of roles, including a number of local authorities, Clare, Roscommon, Meath, Dublin City Council, on board Trinola, and then I think for quite a while in the Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage, as it is now, before joining the OPR in 2019 upon its establishment. I was always drawn to planning. I didn't really probably know as much about it as a career until a tremendous pair of geography and career guidance teachers spotted something in St. Patrick's Classical School in Navan back in the early 1980s and said planning is something you should do. But I was always hugely interested in geography. I was hugely interested in place and the history of place and why things were kind of the shape they were. I travelled around with my family a lot in Ireland in my childhood. I suppose that gave always a changing geographical perspective of different parts of the country, West Cork, through to Meath, into Dublin and so on. So I was always drawn to the areas of planning, architecture, engineering, etc. And at the time I was studying UCD. The master's course was the only course in Ireland. So my career guidance and geography teachers recommended I would do an undergraduate degree in Maynooth University in geography, and it was a course that was always very aligned to planning. So I did geography economics there, went into UCD, had 2 good years in Richview, and then embarked on the planning career after that. I suppose when I graduated in 1989, it was a time of significant economic challenge. So there were very, very few jobs at the time, but I was lucky enough to start with Clare County Council, Kieran Lynch and his great team down there. Yeah, it's just been a fantastic journey, career journey since then. Always interesting.
We'll talk about resourcing later on, but just out of interest, how many were in that MRUP class in the late 80s?
It started out, I think, with 18. It was a full class. There was various bits of attrition due to people changing their minds, people moving, whatnot. So I think in terms of graduates, at the end of the day, it was 14, 15 or thereabouts, you know?
Yeah. No, and I suppose it's just interesting in the context. I think there was something like the late 20s, the year I graduated, and very few of us, because of the time it was, very few of us ended up working in the Republic at all. So it's kind of lost some of that. The 2 things really that I'd hope that we could talk about in a bit of detail today, and I suppose first is the legislation, because that's top of a lot of practitioners' minds. It's either on top of their minds or it's in the back of their minds as something that they think should be at the top of their mind. And then the other thing I think would be interesting to talk about is the wider work of the OPR, maybe, and some of the stuff that you're doing or are planning on doing. But to go straight into the legislation, from your point of view, and you'd have worked on the 2000 legislation as it went its way through, so you're very familiar with the the process and I suppose the act that it's replacing. But is there anything just for you that stands out as particularly welcome or particularly important in the 2024 legislation that you're looking forward to kind of seeing getting up and running?
Yeah, well, look, I suppose if you like, the doubling down, Sean, on the importance of the plan-led system is, I suppose, something that is particularly welcome from my point of view. In the world of planning that I started out on, late 1980s, planning was much more, development driven, almost driven by the individual case. There were 88 planning authorities. There was no regional structure. There was the Eastern Regional Development Organization, ERDO, some people might remember, but it was all non-statutory. There was a national planning statement or framework or strategy, all in the realm of, I suppose, either history in terms of the Buchanan Report or fantasy. So through various jigs and reels, thankfully Ireland has moved progressively towards a more plan-led system. National planning framework, regional spatial economic strategies, local development plans, city and county development plans and local area plans, and indeed SDZ planning schemes. And indeed that structure is going to evolve, quite significantly, with the urban development plans and so on. I just think that is, a statement of, I suppose, faith in the importance of a planning system, first of all, but also a planning system that has at its heart, the relevant strategies at national, regional and local levels to sort of, point the way forward. And, when you look around what's happening in different parts of the world, it is sometimes interesting, maybe surprising, maybe disappointing, the degree to which you don't find that hierarchy of plans in other jurisdictions. And, that's a decision that the other jurisdictions will make for their own reasons and so on. But I think, particularly since Project Ireland 2040, the alignment of the planning framework, national planning framework and the National Development Plan was achieved back in 2018. I suppose the benefits of that are becoming clearer and clearer, in the context of the alignment of capital investment and spatial planning and that. And, there is now some fairly serious money flowing towards, signature urban and rural development and regeneration projects right around this country. Not because somebody dreamt up of a project, but because that's what the plan identified as the requirement. So whether in Waterford or in Cork or in parts of Dublin and so on, you can see huge urban development projects, regeneration projects, etc., progressing because of a plan-led system. So I was particularly pleased to see, if you like, that not only sort of continued in the P&D Act 24, but actually increased or strengthened even further, particularly in the context of the different types of effectively local plans to respond to different contexts, the ones that straddle the local authority borders, the places that are going to undergo significant change, etc. And I suppose the more typical stock in trade of the local plans. So that's all good.
Two things spring to mind, I suppose. One, you mentioned looking around the world. Where you're sitting today, or maybe previously when you were working in the Custom House, obviously planning is very context specific, and that's sometimes lost, and it's obviously bound up with culture and legal systems and a whole host of other things. Is there a model somewhere that you thought that we should be following, or you kind of happy with the path that we followed?
Well, as some on the podcast probably would be familiar with, I was in the department, at the time. In effect, the pivot was achieved from, the sort of obsolete national spatial strategy into national planning framework, and the concept of it was legislated for, in legislation, back in the sort of the late 2017, 18, etc. stage. But I suppose the experience in Scotland was particularly interesting. Geographically, it was proximate. In some shapes and forms, a country or a place, a part of the UK that is not a million miles from our spatial context, population broadly similar, very sort of dominant sort of key urban centres in the central belt, and more remote and highland and rural areas to the north and west and east and so on and south. And I suppose what they had achieved in the context of, publishing their first national planning framework, and indeed, the professional planning team that I got to know very well, interacted with through the sort of informal 5 administrations network of senior planning officials across, effectively UK and Ireland, just seemed very interesting to me. And particularly the concept, Sean, of, the national infrastructures. So I found the National Planning Framework to be a very practical, very sensible model in terms of not trying to do, the plan for every part of the country, but picking out those things that are absolutely critical and strategic from a national perspective to sort of double down on in relation to planning objective, planning policies, but also things that we need to do and deliver, whether it's in relation to critical infrastructures in terms of transport, in relation to climate, in relation to housing, and so on. So I think there was a kind of a rich sort of cross-pollination between the Scottish experience around the National Planning Framework and indeed the legislation for it, and indeed what we were doing, back, I suppose, nearly 10 years ago at this stage.
Mm. Something else you mentioned was that thing about, I suppose, the new suite of plans, or the new opportunities for plans at the maybe sub-city or county level. From your point of view as the regulator, how challenging has it been challenging maybe when you're doing that evaluation of plans role? Has there been inconsistencies, or how do you deal with inconsistencies when it comes to kind of local authority borders and stuff like that? You hear examples, and you'd be more familiar with them than I would. You hear anecdotal examples of, a landscape, you cross the county bounds and a landscape is suddenly very sensitive in one county rather than compared to the county next door, or parking standards are, widely different maybe when there's a city-county interface. Is that stuff that you think is going to be easier? Is that stuff you've had to work through, or are those differences overstated?
Sometimes I think those differences are overstated, Sean, because I suppose there is an important balance to strike here between, in effect, avoiding a one-size-fits-all approach, kind of a straitjacket approach on the one side, which maybe sounds strange coming from a planner. I suppose allowing, if you like, I suppose the local issues, the local circumstances to, reflect into the relevant spatial plans. I suppose from our point of view in the OPR, we're focusing on what is laid out very clearly, pretty much in black and white terms, or as close as possible to it, in the National Planning Framework, various different ministerial guidelines, and so on and so forth. So our rule of thumb is that if government has very clearly set out that a particular thing needs to be done, for example, we don't put highly vulnerable development, residential development or critical infrastructures and so on in areas that are at significant risk of flooding, which could, have devastating consequences. Government has said very clearly that is the case, and that the Office of Public Works and its whole CFRAMS process is the font of knowledge in relation to what is and what isn't at risk of flooding, subject to further verification at local level and so on. So our rule of thumb is that if government has said that's what needs to be delivered at local level, that needs to be followed through, and that's our role as effectively the referee in the planning match to see that done. Now, it is the case, there's no doubt about it, that there is more work to be done in terms of where there can be, fairly glaring inconsistencies between different development plans. So yes, it is a point of significant concern from my point of view and the work of the OPR, as we've highlighted in research. And I think government is now acting on this, that, for example, many local development plans will have, as regards renewable energy, either go or no-go areas, and then you go across the border into the neighbouring local authority and it's the flip opposite. And in the same landscape context, broadly speaking, in the same infrastructural context. So, for people in on the podcast, if you're travelling down the motorway from Dublin to Galway, when you sort of meet the split between effectively the road to Sligo and the road to Galway, you can see the huge new wind farm development there on the left hand side, Yellow River, which is a crucial part of Ireland's sort of decarbonisation journey, and is going to have a massive positive impact in terms of generating green, clean energy. That's in one local authority area. I won't get into the specifics. But as you move on down that road heading west, it's another local authority area on the other side. It's all still largely peatland and so on, bog, etc. And there are a lot more restrictions, if you like, in the other local authority and so on. So that's frustrating to see. I suppose we've had, some issues as well in relation to metropolitan planning around the cities. Again, without going into specifics, we would have argued, for example, in one set of evaluations a little while ago in relation to two local authorities that are involved in a particular city area that, that the relevant plans should share a common chapter, of basic parameters, etc. So whether you pick up the document in relation to the city part or the environs part or the county part around it, you'd kind of see, as regards the city and its environs, a common set of parameters and considerations, etc. And that proved very difficult and ultimately wasn't achieved in full anyway. But I always say, and I suppose with the perspective of 36 years in planning and seeing the journey that we've come on, from no NPF, no regional tier and any sort of great strength, and indeed development plans that were little more than development management manuals for how big a site was or what the sight lines were, to see the stuff that's going on around the country now, really positive stuff in relation to the type of things I mentioned earlier. To the extent we have coordination issues, that is the work in terms of working through those and trying to find that balance that I mentioned earlier.
And back to the legislation then, so Part 18, I think, is the one that relates specifically to the...
It's good you remember that. Yeah, there's a lot of parts there.
Many parts and many pages, and many volumes at the moment as well. But some things are new in that, some stays the same, some things are maybe slightly restaged in terms of how you're set up and your functions and things like that. One thing that is new is the advisory board. But what do you think that advisory board is going to bring, or are there other changes through the legislation that you're looking forward to starting to implement?
Well, I suppose in relation to our own functions, I think I would, of course, say wisely, the legislature kind of left the broad, if you like, function remit of the OPR, with some differences, but left it largely as it was in the, the previous legislation, the 2000 Act as amended. And I suppose we're still, relatively young as an organisation, just 6 years old or thereabouts now. There are some, if you like, important new functions. For example, we have a compliant handling function, review function in the context of local authorities. There was something of a lacuna in the legislation around us entertaining complaints in relation to Bord Pleanála. Indeed, that caused us some difficulties when, I suppose, the issues arose in relation to Bord Pleanála. But that's clarified now. And, there are other, as I said, important evolutions in relation to our functions, in relation to plans assessment. We'll have, I suppose, that role in relation to offering opinions to the local authorities at the very early stages of the plan making process, so less of the coming in the mid and later stages, but actually, having the opportunity to have the good dialogue with the local authorities, just to highlight, things that are important from our perspective at the earliest possible stages. It's always better to try and identify those there and deal with them there rather than it coming up later and later, and then, that can cause difficulties later on. But yeah, you're right, Sean. The standout piece in the 24 Act as regards the OPR is the addition of an advisory board to the structure of the OPR. And just for the record, it's something I very strongly welcome. And now, just for your listeners who mightn't be familiar with the detail of the legislation, the advisory board functions will be in relation to, working with us and setting the overall strategy for the organization, our corporate strategy, the 5-year sort of, I suppose, strategic plan, if you like, that the OPR has for itself, which is part and parcel of the code of practice for governance and state bodies and things like that. And which we all have to revisit after, elections and changes of government and, new programs of government and so on. And it's an advisory board that will also, if you like, steer us in the context of the delivery of that strategy, and if you like, I suppose, journey with us in the context of its implementation. So it won't have, if you like, an executive function in relation to what we do at a day-to-day level, for obviously good governance reasons. We are an independent oversight body in the planning process. Sometimes we have to examine, particular matters that are brought to our attention and so on. And then obviously there's the plans assessment process, which goes through obviously the plans assessment team. So I suppose the role of the advisory board is more strategic than that. I suppose, making sure that, I suppose, if you like, as I said, the overall direction of the organization is well calibrated, to the context that we work within, overall government policy, etc. So there will be a chairperson of the advisory board. There'll be a number of ordinary members. There's a process that's going to power up on that, later on this year through the state boards, public appointments sort of process that there is in place for all sort of state appointments. We're very much gearing up here, Sean, to, if you like, welcome that board into being with us and to work with it as it forms, And I think it will, actually add, an additional voice, if you like, to the work of the OPR. As you're well aware, and listeners will be aware or may have views on, sometimes our work comes in for commentary, in the media, through the political process, and that's fine. That's fair game. It's part and parcel of the territory. But it's only when you're actually, if you like, witnessing what we're doing and what we're seeing and what we're engaging with, you're fully sort of, grounded in the facts. So people will sometimes react to a headline they see or something that somebody said, It's only when you actually look at the file and you go through, matters, I suppose, you start to see maybe the bigger picture in terms of what we're dealing with. You mentioned the resourcing of the planning system earlier, and, the real pressures that puts local authorities under, and how sometimes they have to cut their cloth according to their measure, in relation to particular planning tasks. To a commentator or somebody writing a piece in the media, it's just that, the planning regulator is helping or not helping, as the case may be, in relation to, their particular cause célèbre. So I think an advisory board will be an important witness to the work we do at a strategic level, and hopefully, I think, an important voice around what's important in that and where it fits into the wider picture.
You mentioned the coverage and the commentary there, and I was having a look just at some recent coverage, and I was surprised, but maybe I shouldn't have been surprised, just how martial kind of some of the headlines were. You were local authorities were having battles with the OPR. I think there was one recently, it was that the development plan was in the OPR's crosshairs and things like that. And I know in the past you've spoken about maybe the personalised nature of some of the commentary and some of the criticism that the OPR has been facing. Just on a basic level, is it difficult to... You're the Chief Executive and Planning Regulator, it's the Office of the Planning Regulator. Does that sometimes blur things a bit, or do you think that's why some of the commentary is kind of personalised, or is this part of a wider issue about how planners, and we will talk about resourcing, I mean, is this kind of a wider thing about how people view planners, or what do you think it is?
I think it's a wider trend in, if you like, public discourse, and media commentary and so on. I think there are many theories abounding in relation to that, Sean. But yeah, if you like, the headlines seem to be getting racier. The strap lines that are used, in various media pieces seem to be getting, if you like, more and more pointed. Whatever people will write in media pieces or say on the airwaves or other media, is very often far from the truth. We don't battle with local authorities. We don't have anyone in crosshairs. We sit down we work with local authorities, with the elected members. Indeed, we have training sessions with them nearly every 2 months. We normally spend, in effect, 2 days with elected members from right across this country, hundreds of them, at training events where, myself and staff included are available for the guts of those 2 days in terms of, debating relevant issues and sometimes queries that, need to be followed up, or questions people have about how we do our work, etc. So the culture of this organization, ethos of this organization is very open, it's very accessible. We work really, really proactively and positively with the hundreds of local authority officials, Board Pleanála officials and others in the broader sort of planning and development space that do their best every day to deliver planning services in the spirit of the legislative and the policy framework laid out for them by government and so on and so forth. So, clearly there can be differences of opinion, in relation to a particular thing. Going back to that flood risk piece, I can recall, if you like, differences of view, whatever about battles, but differences of view between ourselves and, say, elected members who might have been proposing particular areas for development, on the basis that effectively, elected members were saying, but, the development interests concerned are telling us, that this area isn't at risk of flooding. And going back to what I said earlier, government has set out, in effect, the National Flood Authority is the Office of Public Works. It has done an exhaustive CFRAM, catchment-based flood risk assessment modelling system, maps online, huge amount of information. So, and indeed, local authorities will engage their own flood experts to sort of further sort of detail what the national picture is. And, that's what policy says we have to follow, effectively the official advice around this, rather than what somebody, maybe whether it is in a piece of evidence or a piece of paper or whatever it is, or commentary, says might be the case, So that's kind of the stock in trade of what we go through every day, or in the context of zoning, which is very topical at the moment. The question really we're all focused on is how deliverable, the housing and the underlying infrastructure that it fundamentally depends on is right here and now or very soon, So is there a lot of point in, zoning land that we know is very distant from, the footprint of our built up areas, where we know there is no, or there will be no water services, transport, schools, amenities and so on for that development for maybe 10 years, and maybe not to zone locations maybe closer to town centres or, that have infrastructure, but maybe sometimes, if you like, draw the heat of being close to existing residential areas that sometimes are, not or maybe somewhat concerned about additional development in existing built-up areas. So they're the kinds of debates we're engaged in with local authorities across this land day in, day out. But they're good debates, and they happen within an open and a transparent process. And ultimately, the vast majority of plans that we assess are consistent with the National Planning Framework. The whole piece around recommendations or directions and so on, that is, in terms of the net of it and where it affects and so on, a really, really small part of the overall functioning of the forward planning system. And, it's an important backstop as well against, things going, significantly bump in the night.
Some of those criticisms of the work of the OPR, do you think some of them are feeling maybe vindicated by the revised MPF? And, we told you so, and you don't understand headroom, you don't understand conversion rates. And, this is what we've been telling you for not you personally, but you personally, and maybe the wider system. This is what we've been saying for years, that, you need to zone much more. Do you think there is I suppose there is a narrative that I've seen out there that, look, I mean, this is common sense, and it's a disgrace that the MPF took so long to be adopted, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And maybe not celebrating it, but I suppose seeing it as vindication for criticism that you've been facing as you've done the work.
Whatever about vindication, I don't think that comes into it, Sean. But I think the important piece is that government remains committed to there being a vision, a long-term vision for territorial, for spatial development of our country. And the metrics have evolved. We have a new census, or the last census, 22. There's much stronger migration. As I was debating with, I think, I suppose people I know in the economics community recently, that things are moving in the right direction when we're arguing about the numbers. not the principle. So nobody's arguing with the principle of there being a need for a long-term vision, certainly not government, certainly not the political process, certainly not local authorities, etc. There will be, if you like, those technical, I suppose, various different interests or viewpoints, debates about whether we're using the right assumptions. NESC, National Economic Social Council, came out with its analysis of brownfield development and compact growth, and where are we in relation to the target around achieving 40% of the delivery of housing, effectively within the fabric of existing cities and towns and built up areas. And, taking the view that that target is quite modest, which they're entitled to do, and so on. So these are all, if you like, enriching contributions to, if you like, a conversation, a national conversation that we probably should have been having a long time ago, but we've, been having more and more in recent years around, the pattern of growth in the country. There's obviously the Dublin piece, the regional piece, urban and rural, and the appropriate, if you like, context within which to have these conversations is, something called a national planning framework or regional spatial economic strategies, etc., and the evolution of those, which indeed underwent, sort of a significant debate in both houses of the Oireachtas in the last few days, and I think, every day is a school day, if you like, in the planning process, because we're always dealing with new things. We're always dealing with new challenges or new missions, if you like, that are important from a social or public or political perspective. And I think, again, one of the, if you like, better strengths of the planning system here in Ireland is that we have that sort of tier of thinking, conversing, and then strategizing and planning to deal with those issues at the national, the regional, and the local level.
And picking up that point of this national conversation, what do you think the role, or what do you see the role of the OPR in that being? Because I mean, you're familiar, there would have been criticism at the time the office was being established, and you still see it sometimes, that there's this tension between the OPR as the policeman, maybe you see yourself as a referee rather than the policeman, and being a teacher and a researcher. And then, you still hear people saying First Furbeha was abolished in 88, but, there needs to be a new first, and needs to do research, needs to be all about data and evidence. And what's different about maybe the research that you're doing versus what people are expecting the first did. And then similarly, you've obviously got one of your key functions is that stemming from the Mahon Tribunal recommendations is about public awareness and the benefits of planning. So how do you juggle all that, or where do you see yourself being able to position yourself in that sort of national conversation about planning?
Yeah, so when I came into the role, Sean, and very much my own vision, and indeed I think the vision of the organisation, the culture that we've created here, comes from a perspective of a sort of a developmental approach to, if you like, planning awareness, planning capacity, the execution of it at a day-to-day level. And I suppose particularly in terms of the research training and public awareness side, that was something that we focused on very, very early on. So, for example, when we came into being in 2019, local development plans were under review to, if you like, reflect the NPF. And I suppose I had my own sort of kind of waking moment of realizing that local elected members in the country, 949 of them, who have planning as probably one of, if not the most important function they discharge at local authority level across the 31 local authorities, actually had never been provided with a national training program on planning since the coming into being of, the modern planning legislation in 1963. So even though we were barely functional, we had, really a skeleton staff. We wrapped ourselves around a very, if you like, deep dive approach in bringing up the awareness, bringing up the sort of the dissemination of key information, and bringing up the, if you like, the level of discourse with elected members across the country on this most important planning function. So, and indeed, that whole, if you like, rich resource base is sitting on our website of, videos, and because all our events, of course, we had COVID, and, we had to pivot our offer after, I think, the initial two events into, an online offer. And that's grown and grown and grown ever since. And of course, we established the National Planning Knowledge Group, the NPKG, if you like, to steer us in the context of what are the big questions in planning at the moment. And, what's our state of knowledge in relation to addressing those questions? And, in what way can we help wider government, local authorities, relevant bodies, civil society indeed, in relation to putting information forward that helps in relation to the policy development, the implementation of various planning steps at a day-to-day level. And we now have, again, a rich, if you like, cupboard or array of, practice notes and various different research papers and so on, which is all trying to feed into, enriching that sort of public awareness, public knowledge around planning. Now, I would say, Sean, that of the sort of 4 areas that the OPR is gathered around are corporate function plans, evaluation, reviews, and research training and public awareness. It's the area probably that hopefully we will, as we resource and we sort of enhance our capacity into the future with the support of the department, minister, etc. That is an area where there's a lot of, I think, rich opportunity, for doing a lot more. And it's interesting, actually, I won't go into the detail of it today, but through various different reflective exercises that we've ongoing, engaging with our those that we work with, periodic critical review that's ongoing at the moment for our own organisation, which is a normal part of state bodies. That's one of the messages that's coming back very loudly and clearly. The stuff we do around that public awareness, training, research, is really good. It's really rich. Could we have an awful lot more of it, And the one thing about it is, plans, assessment, reviews and all of that, they're resource intensive, of course. But, engaging with the public, communication stuff and research is particularly resource heavy or demanding. And I suppose just in relation to all of our functions, and like any other public body or indeed any other organisation, we have to balance, what we can do with the resources that we have available to us. We have grown rapidly and with great support from the Department of Housing. It has to be said, since we were founded in 2019, we've 47 staff here now, discharging a whole range of functions. But I suppose my sort of vision for the future would be particularly around further strengthening that sort of, if you like, conversational training, research, etc. piece.
Are you going to become one of those new basking sharks, taking all these? But like what I'm hearing is that some of the things that you'd like to do in the future, probably planners maybe aren't the people to do it. There's a whole range of other expertises out there to get it. But do you still need to resource up the other functions that you have as well? Or do you think the size of the organisation is going to stay pretty much stable as you move into the new legislation? Yeah,
I think we're probably coming up to the point, where we're not at the level that we need to be at, to discharge all of our functions, certainly in the context of the Planning Act 24. And that's a piece, that we discuss and we progress with the parent department. Yeah, there's that sense, all right, that we're sort of hoovering up, the staff that local authorities and others so desperately need. Well, I suppose we're a minnow in the if I stay with the sort of fishy theme, we're a minnow in the overall seascape of planning. Bortonala, sort of heading for just over whatever it is, 300 staff. Pick any large planning department around the country would dwarf us. And in fact, of course, the vast majority of our staff are in the administrative grades and so on. We have a significant but not a huge complement of professional planners here. And indeed, Sean, I'd say that the fact that opportunities are now presenting in organisations like the OPR, the Department of Housing indeed, and many other state bodies, for people who are listening in on the podcasts, when I think about, if you like, the career opportunities and the different roles that you can work in today, compared to when I came out from Richview in 1989, where basically you were dealing with planning applications, you were doing a development plan, you might have been working in Bortonala on a planning appeal. I mean, when you look at the range of stuff and the interesting and purposeful work that's available now, it creates of itself a very rich, I suppose, context for people to continually hone and maybe develop new skills, etc. It's been interesting, I suppose, just by way of example, the degree to which I've seen, some of the staff that have come to the OPR from working in local authorities, maybe predominantly in a development management role or maybe in the plan making role. And when they see, if you like, I suppose from the OPR's perspective, what's going on right around the country, how people have really grown in relation to the awareness of the issues and the skills needed to grapple with them, etc. So I think in its own modest way, the OPR has created a very good developmental, I suppose, base for people in terms of maybe picking up new skills, making new contributions to the planning system, developing their careers in the longer run, etc.
And when there's so much churn, though, does that I presume that means the same as every organization or every employer in the space at the moment, you're losing people then again to new opportunities, and there's that degree of churn. Just kind of closing out that conversation about, I suppose, the different functions that you have, though, and bringing it back to the public. Obviously, part of it is, you mentioned the reviews, or the reviews piece of local authorities and where the board sits within that. But in terms of the kind of systemic stuff, and I know you report on this, but what problems with the planning system, or what issues do members of the public come to you about, whether or not you're the appropriate organisation for it? And obviously it's not all sorts of complaints you get, but are you seeing any trends in terms of the issues that people are coming to you trying to raise complaints about with, is that relatively flat?
I suppose in relation to, matters that are brought to our attention from a, public, Joe public, Mary public perspective, I suppose it's the access to services, the responsiveness of services to issues that have arisen at local authority level, seem to, I suppose, come up a lot. It is fair to say, Sean, that we still see a lot of correspondence to us around, matters that we're restricted from engaging with. So we are not another Bord Pleanála. We're not another body to get your, particular query with the local authority dealt with. So we are there, to address, as you say, systemic issues in relation to the discharge of statutory planning functions by local authorities. And, there may be different views about this, but it is the case that, the number of complaints that actually go through our whole sort of preliminary examination perspective and, then effectively result in something that's upheld is a very, very small proportion of the overall amount of correspondence we receive. So, what that's telling us is that, yes, while the planning system is operating under huge load, under huge pressure, by and large, in relation to the vast majority of its functions, it is discharging its statutory obligations. 30,000 planning applications or thereabouts considered and approved every year. About 7-8% of those appeal to Bord Pleanála. Only about a third of those are overturned by the board, and a very much smaller fraction than that, again, actually subject to judicial review. I suppose where we see that sort of concern or complaint coming from the public, it's around, I've been waiting weeks, for a conversation with the local authority around my particular planning application. Or indeed, I may have been told by the local authority concerned that they can't provide that service anymore, because they have a lot of pressure in relation to other areas of work. Or, there are concerns about, very long delays in progressing enforcement, action and so on. Or sometimes there are maybe misunderstandings that arise in relation to administrative requirements, legal requirements, etc. And, they're raised to us. We've identified quite a few of those, and thankfully been able to clear them up with the relevant local authority. But insofar as I sort of read across from, if you like, the submissions that really impact, my sense of it, Sean, is that, the system is operating under too much pressure. All of which, of course, are manifestations of, dealing with a rapidly growing economy, significant demand for planning services coming at us very quickly during the late 2010s into the early 2020s, from a historical context of cutbacks at local authority level, which the system hasn't even really fully recovered from. So, no surprise around things like the strategic workforce plan, the ministerial action plan, our learning and development strategy, and the need to sort of put capacity back into the planning system, which, is still very much a work in progress, because it really only kind of lit up to a significant degree in the last 2 or 3 years.
And there's just two things on that to close out on, I guess. I suppose one is there examples, or have you seen stuff through the review work maybe in local authorities in terms of innovation or efficiencies? Are there opportunities for innovation and efficiency and technology that you think you need to see replicated, share examples of best practice? Is there stuff working particularly well that you think needs to be shared across the system?
Totally. And I think the technology piece is an absolutely crucial one. The planning system is, very much a latecomer to, the digital economy is the wrong word, but the digital way of doing things. It has been largely, a paper-based system up until relatively recently. Whilst we now have a national planning application, I suppose access portal, the back office behind that is still fairly rudimentary and fairly paper-based. But, the sector, the local government sector that is, with the support of the department, is alive to this, maybe partly due to our urgings as well, and is moving on it. But just at a practical level, something that really kind of caught my eye there a little while back was, effectively a very effective, straightforward, not very costly to implement ICT platform for online planning application, pre-application consultation services developed between Carlow, County Council, Galway, County Council, etc. Just online forms, and effectively where people who are trying to figure out what might be in the mind of the planning authority in terms of its assessment of something they had in mind, whether it's an extension to the house or, commercial premises or building a house, whatever. They could screen a lot of those issues, through an appropriate online forum. And to be honest with you, Sean, I don't for the life of me understand why, say a really good platform like that isn't just immediately picked up and implemented at a national level. Now we're working to push that agenda as the sort of the regulator, and we will see more progress around that, particularly in the context of the Ministerial Action Plan on planning resourcing, which has working group number 5, which we're involved in, on innovation, efficiency, etc., etc. So, again, some local authorities have really good customer relations management CRM systems for the planning enforcement and tracking all of that. Others, are still largely paper-based. So, again, I think that's an area for the Working Group 5 to sort of grapple with in a more, if you like, holistic and more coordinated approach right across the sector.
And then we talked about efficiency and innovation, and we talked about people, but also there's a financial element. And I know this is something that's in the planning in numbers, or not planning by numbers, planning in numbers publication that you had, and that's just that financial resourcing piece, and I suppose this idea of maybe cost recovery and actually maybe two things. Obviously, you were in the department for a period of time. Is there a reason why planning fees don't keep pace maybe with inflation like they do in other jurisdictions? Is there some stuff too expensive and some stuff too cheap? And I think there's a willingness maybe to pay for a service, obviously, and then you need to manage that as well. But what do you think the end point of that is going to be as planning fees get rebalanced or reviewed or revised?
Okay, well, I mean, the first thing to get straight around this is indeed that the setting of planning fees is a matter for effectively government, minister, etc., as recently reformed in the PD Act 24. But look, I'm not going to beat around the bush on this. It is a matter of very significant concern that planning fees and charges, even the scope of them, haven't changed since 2001. I mentioned pre-application consultation. So, currently that's a free service, which is great. But if, pre-application consultation can be significantly time consuming, especially if you have to have a number of officers of the local authority involved, the roads side, the environment side, as well as planning. Sometimes it might even require, prior research, maybe even field work and so on. So their hours, their time, somebody has to fuel up a vehicle to go and see things, and then that's a resource that's not available to, dealing with the stuff that actually has a statutory time frame, development plan preparation, planning applications, enforcement cases, etc. So is it fair, that the many people who look for a pre-application consultation service don't pay for a service which takes the staff away from the functions that do actually attract a fee and a charge, and for which there is, huge demand, for delivery at a day-to-day level. So the National Oversight and Audit Commission as well has for quite a few years been drawing attention to the fact that, the planning service across the country, which costs around 160 million euros to run at local authority level, attracts, barely 20%, 16, 17% of that cost in terms of fees and charges. So if we know we have to invest in people, ICT, better plans and so on, all the good stuff that the OPR is seeking, and local authorities, effectively are working within a financial context where, they have their sources of income, and it's effectively a choice between providing fire services or street lighting or housing functions and planning. Is that really right? The old phrase, sort of fail to plan, prepare to fail. So really, really important that the planning function is appropriately resourced. Cost recovery, these are all matters for the decision makers, relevant decision makers around it. You can argue around the degree to which planning functions do actually deliver, public services and so on. But I think ratepayers and taxpayers, deserve, at least a fair contribution from those that are routinely day in, day out accessing planning services. And, a fair contribution is not 20%.
Still going to be difficult to be, I would imagine, maybe difficult to be the politician to say that I think your one-off house should, we're not top. If you're looking at Northern Ireland, for example, you're not talking about the fee for a one-off house doubling, you're talking 10, 15, 20 times what it is now. But I guess that's something that is going to have to come to a head at some stage, 25 years on from when those fees were set.
Yeah, no, it's 25 years, or 24 years, whatever it is, since planning fees and charges were looked at. It is the case that our fees and charges here are seriously out of step with even our nearest neighbours in Northern Ireland, or indeed anywhere in the UK, or indeed anywhere in Europe, or indeed further abroad. And we've looked at this in the OPR. We've done a piece of work on this. And we just have to think about it from a fairness point of view. If we're expecting our local authorities, and our local authorities need support, they're the bedrock of the planning system. I don't think it's fair to be adding, if you like, more expectations on them to, deliver on government policies and OPR assessments and reviews, and indeed implementing really complex, EU legislation, which requires, ecological assessments and flood risk assessments and noise assessments and so on. And all these experts, that all, if you like, adds to the bill for the assessing the planning application, and still only get 65 euros per house from the person making the planning application, So I would be hopeful, that, if you like, this really important area will be grappled with, by government ministers and so on in the context of the P&D regs, etc. And indeed, I suppose, broadening the base of activities that draw fees and charges and so on. Because I think there are things that people want planning authorities to do, but for which planning authorities get absolutely no income at the moment. And that's causing them a real difficulty at a practical level on the ground. And that needs to be sorted out.
And then finally, is there anything that you wanted to raise that we didn't talk about?
I suppose just to acknowledge the important, if you like, anniversary that this year represents, and indeed next year will represent in the context of, the Planning Appeals Board, Board Pleanála becoming the Comisiún Pleanála. The IPI is 50 years old this year, and that, whilst I suppose planning is very often maybe in the crosshairs of the media, as you referenced earlier, or political commentary and all of that, eaten bread is soon forgotten is the phrase. And I think around when I studied in Maynooth in the early 1980s, we didn't even have a train service. We barely had a bus service, and, no retail, very poor schools, a small campus. A lot has been achieved in terms of, I suppose, our progression and development as a country, really strong economy. Yeah, huge issues around housing, which are manifestations of, to some extent, our strong economic growth. And in these years of anniversaries around, the planning system being around for quite some time, it is heartening, Sean, to see that, I suppose, government, the legislature and so on has, I think, further consolidated the importance of there being a planning system, and are now finally starting to grapple with the issues around resourcing it, etc., though there's still quite a bit of road to travel on that front. So, notwithstanding the fact there are things that are not quite right and we have to do better, etc., into the future, I take a lot of comfort from where we've come from. As I look back on my, heading for 40 years service in the planning area, and the opportunities are tremendous into the future. As long as we all work together, we're respectful, we look after each other in terms of how we work and interact, etc. We support each other's development, etc. And we always keep the needs of the citizen, that ultimately the planning service serves, at the very heart of our thinking. And that certainly is the case in the work here in the Office of the Planning Regulator.
Niall, thanks for your time.
Thanks very much, Sean. Really enjoyed that. Thank you.
If you would like to find out more about what we covered in this episode, you'll find notes, links, and more in the description area of this podcast. Do remember to press follow for our show so you'll get the next episode automatically, and remember to share it with a friend in the sector. Just tell them to search Irish Planning Institute on their podcast app. Our podcast today was produced by dustpod.io and brought to you by the Irish Planning Institute. From me, Sean O'Leary, thank you for listening.